I loved when Chip talked about the distinction between, you know, the mechanism of how the principles work is fascinating and is helpful. But the primary understanding and our purpose here in this school is to deepen our understanding of, as Sid said, what they are, what these principles are. And the simplicity and beauty is that we educate ourselves every time we have an insight. We teach ourselves the principles. So even though we'll ask each other and we'll read and we'll watch DVDs, you know, SIDS and so many other resources that are out there now, Sid still has the simplest explanation. And he'll tell us in his tapes, I can't explain the principles because they're unexplainable. It'll be you know, your experience. But I'll do my best, he would say. And he would explain them like in 3 sentences. And he'd say, there, you know. And to this day, his explanation is the simplest of anybody out there. There's a story to that, right? There's a story to reflect on your own. That the man who uncovered these principles to the day he passed out of this world gave the simplest explanation of all. And yet, we are our own teachers. So there's thought. I shared an insight with you that how I taught myself about the principle of thought. I'll share with you how I learned about consciousness. There were 2 things. Consciousness to me meant what was wrong in my life. I was conscious of when I did bad. You know, what was wrong with the world. That's what I was conscious of. That's how I was brought up. And that's what I understood. And when Sid would talk to Ken and I about consciousness, he talked about soul. You know, that consciousness, pure consciousness is pure soul. Well, I felt something. It was, you know, it stirred me, but I couldn't grasp it. And then there was one point where I would say that to Sid, like, I don't understand what you're saying, but I feel something, you know, I get a sense of that. And he'd say, well, dearie, that sense of it is good enough. When you're sensing there's something there, that's what you're sensing. That's consciousness in action. Okay, I thought I'll hold that. I don't get it, but you know, I'll hold that. And then I was in another city somewhere doing a program for somebody, for a group, and it was a foundation program. And this was at the point in the evolution of the 3 principles community where Sid discovered that there were core concepts that had been formed in the 3 principles psychological attempt to break it down so the world could understand more about the principles. When Sid discovered that, he brought us together and said, don't do that. You know, come back home. Come back to the principles. That's where the answers are. That's where the power is. That's who you are. Come back to the principles. When you share about the principles. The faculty at that time, we were all kind of scratching our head thinking, well, I don't really know anything about the principles. I know a little bit about thought. This is what I'm thinking. I don't know anything about mind. I don't know anything really about consciousness. And we're going to go and do training programs like for 3 days on the principles? That's impossible. And so all the faculty at this point, that's what we're looking at, is how can we possibly fill 3 days? I can say what I know in 5 minutes. So the first place I went to was in Denver, and I was doing this one on my own. And it was the second foundation program where I was supposed to be talking more about applications of the principles. But I wanted to listen, to kind of check in with the group and see where they were and what they were learning. And I knew in the listening that would help me bridge the gap between what I wanted to offer and where the audience was. And they started to share with me that they saw a hierarchy in the principles. They saw mind as number 1, they saw consciousness as number 2, and they saw thought as number 3. And somehow that didn't feel right. And I couldn't get together why, so I just listened some more. And, you know, drew out of the audience more like, why? And so they shared more about this hierarchy, that mind, that consciousness and thought came from mind. And there was a real separation, and I got in the moment that these are all spiritual energy principles. If it's pure energy, there's no form. So how can there be a hierarchy when there's no form? That's the logic that occurred to me. Again, I never knew that. I would never have thought that in a million years. I have no background that would have prepared me to say that. That logic came to me in the moment because the form that I heard from the audience didn't make sense. It didn't feel right. I didn't get why. I listened more, and the answer came. There's no logic to that. Pure energy has no form. Therefore, there can't be a hierarchy. Therefore, all 3 principles are the same. That's as far as I could go. That's what I shared. But the certainty that came out of that insight settled the audience down, and many of them started to question, that makes sense to me too. That's the power of insight. That's the power knowing that every person in the world is the same spiritual power that we are. And so when you're coming from that spiritual power with certainty, you're touching those that you're in contact with certainty. And their certainty rises to meet your certainty, and there you go. You're in harmony with divine mind, divine consciousness, and divine thought. Self-educators, that's who we are. Spiritual self-educators. That's the purpose of insight.